Miss Johnson had always dreamed of becoming a teacher. Even as a little girl, she would line up her dolls and pretend to teach them math and reading. Now, at 28 years old, she was living that dream at Lincoln High School. But some days, she wondered if teaching was really what she had imagined it would be. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of her classroom as she arranged papers on her desk. Her third year of teaching was going well overall, but there was one class that made her stomach turn with worry every single day. Fifth period. Just thinking about it made her take a deep breath and remind herself why she became a teacher in the first place. Most of her students were wonderful. There was quiet Amy, who always sat in the front row and asked thoughtful questions about the books they read. There was David, the class clown who made everyone laugh but still managed to turn in great essays. And there was Lisa, who struggled with reading but never gave up trying. These students made teaching worth it. They reminded Miss Johnson why she loved her job. But then there were the three boys who sat in the back corner. They thought they ruled the school, and maybe they did. Other teachers had warned her about them during lunch breaks in the faculty room. "Just wait until you meet Jake, Tyler, and Cole," Mrs. Peterson had said while stirring her coffee. She taught math and had dealt with them the year before. "Those three are trouble with a capital T. They think it's funny to make teachers look foolish, especially the younger female teachers." Miss Johnson had listened to these warnings, but she believed every student deserved a fair chance. She had grown up in a tough neighborhood herself and knew that sometimes kids acted out because they had problems at home or felt misunderstood. She wanted to be the teacher who could reach even the most difficult students. The three boys had started testing her from day one. It began small, whispering during lessons, accidentally dropping books to make noise and rolling their eyes when she asked them questions. Miss Johnson tried to handle it with patience and understanding. She would give them gentle reminders about classroom rules and tried to involve them in discussions. But as weeks went by, their behavior got worse. They started making comments under their breath that only students nearby could hear. Comments about her clothes, her hair, the way she walked. She could see other students looking uncomfortable, but no one wanted to speak up against the three bullies. Who could blame them? These boys had a reputation for making life miserable for anyone who crossed them. Miss Johnson had tried everything she could think of. She moved their seats apart, hoping to break up their little group. They just found new ways to communicate and cause disruption. She tried keeping them after class for private conversations, explaining how their behavior affected other students' learning. They would nod and apologize, then go right back to their old ways the next day. She even tried calling their parents. Jake's mom seemed nice enough on the phone and promised to talk to her son. Tyler's dad sounded annoyed and said he would handle it. Cole's grandmother, who was raising him, sighed deeply and said she would do what she could. But nothing changed. If anything, the boys seemed angry that she had contacted home and their behavior got even worse. The breaking point came on a rainy Tuesday in October. Miss Johnson was teaching a lesson about Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet. She had worked hard to make the old play interesting for modern teenagers, relating the family feud to conflicts they might understand. Most students were engaged, asking questions and sharing their thoughts about the characters. But the three troublemakers in the back were having their own conversation. She could hear them snickering and whispering. When she asked them to pay attention, Jake looked right at her and said, "Why should we care about some old dead guy's boring stories?" "Because Shakespeare wrote about human emotions and conflicts that still matter today," Miss Johnson replied calmly. "The themes in his plays are just as relevant now as they were 400 years ago." Tyler laughed loudly. "Yeah, right. Like some dude in tights talking about love is going to help us with anything." The rest of the class giggled nervously. Miss Johnson felt her cheeks flush but kept her voice steady. "Actually, if you gave it a chance, you might find connections to your own life. The characters face many of the same challenges teenagers face today." That's when Cole spoke up with a smirk. "The only thing I want to connect with is getting out of this boring class." The comment wasn't the worst thing they had ever said, but something about the way he said it, combined with the looks the three boys exchanged, made Miss Johnson realize this was bigger than just typical teenage attitude. These boys had no respect for her as a teacher or as a person. They saw her as a target, someone they could push around because she was young and tried to be understanding. After class, as students filed out, she noticed the three troublemakers lingering by the door. They were whispering and looking at her, with expressions that made her uncomfortable. One of them had his phone out, and she caught them glancing between the phone screen and her. A cold feeling settled in her stomach. That afternoon, Miss Johnson stayed late grading papers and thinking about what to do. She loved teaching, but these three students were making her dread coming to work. She had tried patience, understanding, and kindness. She had followed all the advice from her college education classes about handling difficult students. Nothing worked. As she packed her bag to leave, she ran into Mr. Williams, the art teacher. He was heading to his car and looked tired. "Rough day?" she asked. He nodded. "Those three boys in your 5th period class were in my art room during lunch. They thought it was funny to mess with some of the pottery projects other students had been working on for weeks. When I confronted them, they acted like it was no big deal." Miss Johnson felt a surge of anger. They destroyed other students' work? Completely ruined 3 pieces that kids had spent hours on. And when I told them they needed to stay after school to help fix what they could, they just walked out. Said I couldn't make them do anything. As Miss Johnson drove home that evening, she realized she wasn't the only teacher having problems with these three. They were systematically targeting staff members, especially women, and getting away with it. The administration seemed either unaware of the extent of the problem or unwilling to take serious action. That night, she lay in bed staring at the ceiling, thinking about all the reasons she became a teacher. She wanted to make a difference in young people's lives. She wanted to inspire a love of learning and help students discover their potential. But how could she do any of that when 3 bullies were allowed to disrupt not just her classroom, but the entire school environment? She thought about her favorite teacher from high school, Mrs. Clark, who had believed in her when no one else did. Mrs. Clark had seen potential in a shy girl from a tough neighborhood and encouraged her to apply for college scholarships. That teacher had changed her life, and Miss Johnson wanted to be that person for her students. But she was beginning to understand that sometimes being a good teacher meant doing more than just being patient and kind. Sometimes it meant standing up and fighting back when students crossed the line. The question was, how could she do that effectively without making things worse? As she finally drifted off to sleep, Miss Johnson made a decision. She wasn't going to let 3 bullies destroy her love of teaching or make other students suffer. She was going to find a way to stop them, no matter what it took. She just had to figure out how. The next few weeks at Lincoln High School felt like walking through a minefield for Miss Johnson. Every morning, she would take a deep breath before entering her 5th period classroom, never knowing what the 3 troublemakers had planned for her that day. But nothing could have prepared her for what happened on that cold November morning. It started like any other day. Miss Johnson had arrived early to prepare for her lessons, arranging handouts and writing important points on the soirées whiteboard. She had planned an interactive discussion about character development in the novel they were reading. She hoped that by getting students involved in the conversation, even the difficult ones might participate positively. The first 4 periods went smoothly. Her students were engaged, asking good questions, and sharing thoughtful insights about the story. Miss Johnson felt that familiar spark of joy that reminded her why she loved teaching. These moments made all the challenges worth it. But as the lunch bell rang and she prepared for 5th period, that familiar knot formed in her stomach. She watched through her classroom window as students filled the hallways, laughing and chatting with friends. Soon her most challenging class would walk through that door. The 3 troublemakers were the last to enter as usual. They strolled, and just as the bell rang, making a show of barely making it on time. Jake plopped down in his seat with an exaggerated sigh. Tyler made a point of loudly dragging his chair across the floor. Cole just smirked as he took his place in the back corner. Miss Johnson decided to start with something positive. "Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you all had a nice lunch. Today we're going to discuss the main character's biggest challenge in Chapter 12. Who can tell me what problem he's facing?" Several hands went up from the front of the room. Amy, as always, was eager to participate. David had clearly done the reading and was ready to share his thoughts. But before Miss Johnson could call on anyone, Tyler made a loud yawning sound. "This is so boring," he announced to no one in particular but loud enough for everyone to hear. Miss Johnson kept her voice calm and professional. "Tyler, we've talked about this before. If you have something to contribute to the discussion, please raise your hand. Otherwise, please listen respectfully while others share their ideas." Jake leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms. What if we don't want to listen to other people's boring ideas about a boring book? Several students turned to look at him, then glanced nervously at Miss Johnson. She could feel the tension in the room building. The well-behaved students always felt uncomfortable when these disruptions happened, and she hated that their learning experience was being ruined. "The book becomes more interesting when we dig deeper into the themes and characters," Miss Johnson replied. "Give it a chance and you might be surprised." Cole laughed sarcastically. "Yeah, right. Like anything in here could surprise us." Miss Johnson felt her patience wearing thin, but she pressed on with the lesson. She turned to the whiteboard to write down some key points that students had mentioned. As she wrote, she could hear whispering and quiet laughter from the back corner, but she tried to ignore it and focus on the students who wanted to learn. That's when Jake decided to take things further than they had ever gone before. He deliberately knocked his pencil off his desk, and it rolled toward the front of the room, stopping near Miss Johnson's feet. She was still writing on the board when she heard it fall. "Oh, sorry, Miss Johnson," Jake said in a fake apologetic voice. "Could you get that for me? I can't reach it from here." Miss Johnson turned around and saw the pencil on the floor. It was obviously a setup. Jake could easily have picked it up himself or walked over to get it, but she decided to just get the pencil and move on with the lesson, rather than turn it into a bigger issue. As she bent down to pick up the pencil, she suddenly felt someone behind her. Tyler had quietly gotten up from his seat and was standing, much too close. At the same time, she noticed Cole had his phone out and appeared to be recording. In that split second, Miss Johnson realized what was happening. Tyler had something in his hand. It looked like a ruler, and he was attempting to use it inappropriately while Cole filmed the whole thing. The intent was clear. They wanted to embarrass her and create some kind of video they could share with other students. The classroom fell completely silent. Every student had seen what was happening. Some gasped in shock. Others just stared with their mouths open. A few girls in the front row looked absolutely horrified. Miss Johnson stood up immediately, her face flushed with anger and embarrassment. Her hands were shaking slightly, but her voice was steady and firm. "Tyler, sit down right now," she said in a tone that brooked no argument. Tyler tried to play innocent. "What? I was just getting up to sharpen my pencil." "Cole, give me your phone, now." Cole clutched his phone protectively. "Why? I wasn't doing anything wrong." "Hand over the phone immediately or I'm calling security." The seriousness in her voice must have gotten through to him because Cole reluctantly handed over his device. Miss Johnson quickly checked the recent videos and found exactly what she expected. Footage of the incident they had just attempted. Jake, Tyler, Cole, outside. Now. The three boys exchanged glances, probably trying to decide if they should argue or comply. The look on Miss Johnson's face made the decision for them. They slowly got up and filed out of the classroom. Miss Johnson turned to address the rest of her students, who were still sitting in stunned silence. "I apologize that you had to witness that inappropriate behavior," she said, her voice still shaking slightly with anger. "We'll continue with our lesson in just a moment. Please discuss the questions on page 43 with the person next to you while I step outside." In the hallway, the three boys were leaning against the lockers, trying to look casual and unconcerned. But Miss Johnson could see the worry in their eyes. They knew they had crossed a major line. "What you just did in there was completely unacceptable," she began, fighting to keep her voice professional despite how violated she felt. "That kind of behavior is not just disrespectful, it's harassment." Jake tried to interrupt. "We were just messing around. It wasn't that big of a deal." "It was a very big deal," Miss Johnson replied firmly. "You attempted to embarrass me in front of the entire class and recorded it without permission. This goes way beyond typical classroom disruption." Tyler looked uncomfortable for the first time. "Look, we didn't mean anything by it. It was just supposed to be funny." "Funny?" Miss Johnson's voice rose slightly. You think humiliating your teacher is funny? You think making other students uncomfortable is entertaining? Cole finally spoke up, but his tone was still defiant. You can't prove we were doing anything wrong, we'll just say it was an accident. Miss Johnson held up his phone. I have the video right here, and 25 witnesses who saw exactly what happened. For the first time, the three boys looked genuinely worried. They seemed to realize that their usual tactics of denial and playing innocent weren't going to work this time. You're going to delete that video right now, Tyler demanded. Actually, I'm keeping this as evidence, Miss Johnson replied calmly. You three need to report to the principal's office immediately. I'll be there shortly to discuss this situation with administration. As the boys walked reluctantly toward the main office, Miss Johnson stood in the empty hallway for a moment, trying to collect herself. She felt angry, embarrassed, and violated. But underneath those feelings was something else. A determination she had never felt before. She had tried being patient. She had tried being understanding. She had tried giving them chances to improve their behavior. But they had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. They had shown her and everyone else in that classroom exactly who they really were. Miss Johnson walked back into her classroom, where her students were still quietly discussing the reading assignment. They looked up at her with a mixture of sympathy and curiosity. Is everything okay, Miss Johnson? Amy asked quietly. Everything will be fine, she replied. And for the first time in months, she truly believed it. Now let's get back to our discussion about how characters handle challenges and overcome obstacles. As she continued with the lesson, Miss Johnson's mind was already working on a plan. Those three boys thought they could intimidate her and get away with anything. They were about to learn how wrong they were. Miss Johnson couldn't sleep that night. She kept replaying the events of the day over and over in her mind. The way those three boys had tried to humiliate her in front of her students. The shock on her other students' faces. The smirks on the troublemakers' faces when they thought they were getting away with it. But what bothered her most was something the principal had said during their meeting that afternoon. When she had shown him the video evidence and explained what happened, he had sighed deeply and said, I'll talk to the boys and their parents. We'll give them detention and make sure they apologize. That's it? Miss Johnson had asked, unable to hide her frustration. Look, I understand you're upset, Principal Martinez had replied, looking tired. But boys will be boys. They're just testing boundaries. A good talking to and some consequences should set them straight. Boys will be boys. The phrase echoed in her head as she stared at the ceiling. She had heard those same words too many times before, usually when male students crossed lines that would never be acceptable if the situation were reversed. The next morning, Miss Johnson arrived at school early, as usual. But instead of going straight to her classroom, she decided to stop by the faculty lounge. She needed coffee, but more than that, she needed to talk to someone who might understand what she was going through. Mrs. Peterson was already there, grading math papers at one of the small tables. She looked up when Miss Johnson walked in. Hey there, Mrs. Peterson said with a concerned smile. I heard about what happened yesterday. Are you okay? Miss Johnson poured herself a cup of coffee and sat down across from her colleague. I've been better. Can I ask you something? When you had those three boys last year, did they cross any lines with you? Mrs. Peterson's expression grew serious. She glanced around to make sure they were alone, then leaned forward. You mean besides the usual disruptions in attitude? She asked quietly. Oh yes. There was this one time when I was writing equations on the board, and I heard them making comments about my body. Very inappropriate comments. When I turned around, they acted like nothing had happened. Miss Johnson felt a chill run down her spine. Did you report it? I tried to, Mrs. Peterson replied with a bitter laugh. I was told there wasn't enough evidence. They said it was just my word against theirs, and boys that age sometimes say stupid things without thinking. Before Miss Johnson could respond, Ms. Garcia, the art teacher, walked into the lounge. She overheard the conversation and shook her head. Are we talking about Jake, Tyler, and Cole? She asked, her voice filled with frustration. Those three made my life miserable last semester. Miss Johnson looked up with interest. What did they do to you? Ms. Garcia sat down with them, looking around to make sure no one else was listening. It started with small things. They would accidentally knock over paint containers, mess up other students' projects, that kind of stuff. But then it got worse. How much worse? Mrs. Peterson asked. They started taking pictures, Ms. Garcia said quietly. Whenever I would bend down to help a student or reach for something, one of them would have their phone out. They thought they were being sneaky, but I caught them several times. Miss Johnson felt sick to her stomach. Did you tell anyone? I reported it to the vice principal, Ms. Garcia replied. He said he would keep an eye on things, but nothing really changed. The boys just got better at hiding what they were doing. Then Mrs. Chen, the librarian, walked in looking exhausted. She had been working at the school for over 15 years and was usually one of the most cheerful staff members. But lately she had seemed stressed and tired. "Morning, ladies," she said, but her usual smile was missing. "Everything okay?" Miss Johnson asked. Mrs. Chen hesitated, then sat down with them. "I probably shouldn't say anything, but since you're all here, those 3 boys from your classes have been causing problems in the library too." "What kind of problems?" Mrs. Peterson asked. "They come in during lunch and study periods," Mrs. Chen explained. "At first I thought they were actually trying to do schoolwork, but then I realized they were just using the library as a place to plan their next pranks. I've caught them taking pictures of female students without permission, making inappropriate videos, and even going through my desk when they thought I wasn't looking." Miss Johnson's coffee cup froze halfway to her lips. "They're doing this to students too?" "Some of the girls have complained to me," Mrs. Chen nodded sadly. "They feel uncomfortable when those boys are around, but they're too scared to report it officially. The boys have a reputation for making life difficult for anyone who crosses them." The 4 women sat in silence for a moment, each lost in their own thoughts. Finally, Miss Johnson spoke up. "So we all know what's going on, but nothing's being done about it?" "What can we do?" Ms. Garcia asked helplessly. "It's our word against theirs, and apparently that's not enough." Miss Johnson felt a spark of anger. "There has to be something we can do. These boys are creating a hostile environment for both staff and students. That's not okay." "I agree," Mrs. Peterson said, "but how do we prove it? They're smart enough to do most of their worst behavior when adults aren't watching." Miss Johnson was quiet for a moment, thinking. Then she had an idea. "What if we started documenting everything?" she suggested. "Every incident, every inappropriate comment, every time they make someone uncomfortable. We could keep detailed records." "That might work," Mrs. Chen said thoughtfully. "I actually have a notebook where I've been writing down things that happen in the library. I started it a few weeks ago when the incidents began increasing." Ms. Garcia looked interested. "I've been keeping notes too, actually. My sister is a lawyer, and she told me to always document workplace harassment, just in case." "This is good," Miss Johnson said, feeling hopeful for the first time in weeks. "If we pool our information together, we might have enough evidence to show that this is a pattern of behavior, not just isolated incidents." Over the next hour, before school officially started, the 4 teachers shared their experiences. Miss Johnson was shocked at how extensive the problem really was. The 3 boys had been systematically targeting female staff members for months, always careful to do their worst behavior when they thought they wouldn't get caught. Mrs. Peterson told them about finding inappropriate drawings on her whiteboard after the boys had been in her room for detention. Ms. Garcia shared how they had deliberately ruined artwork that female students had been working on for weeks. Mrs. Chen revealed that she had found evidence of the boys going through female teachers' personal belongings when they were left unattended. But perhaps most disturbing were the stories about how they treated female students. Several girls had confided in Mrs. Chen about feeling uncomfortable around the 3 boys. They talked about unwanted attention, inappropriate comments, and feeling like they were being watched and judged constantly. "This is bigger than just pranks and classroom disruption," Miss Johnson realized. "They're creating an atmosphere where women and girls don't feel safe or respected." "Exactly," Mrs. Peterson agreed. "And it's not just affecting us. Other students are seeing this behavior and thinking it's acceptable. We're not just dealing with 3 troublemakers. We're potentially looking at a problem that could influence the whole school culture. As they talked, Miss Johnson began to see the full scope of what was happening. These 3 boys had been getting away with increasingly inappropriate behavior for so long that they felt untouchable. They had learned that they could push boundaries without facing real consequences, so they kept pushing further and further. "I think I need to do some more investigating," Miss Johnson said finally. "If we're going to stop this, we need to have a complete picture of what's been going on." "Be careful," Ms. Garcia warned. "If they find out you're digging into their behavior, they might retaliate." "Let them try," Miss Johnson replied with a determination that surprised even herself. "I'm done being intimidated by teenage bullies." After school that day, Miss Johnson stayed late to organize all the information she had gathered. She created a timeline of incidents, noting dates, witnesses, and specific details. As she worked, she realized that the pattern was even clearer than she had thought. The 3 boys had been systematically testing limits, seeing how far they could push before facing real consequences. When they got away with small things, they moved on to bigger things. When their behavior toward female staff was ignored or minimized, they became bolder. Miss Johnson also noticed something else interesting. The incidents had been escalating in frequency over the past 2 months. It was as if the boys were building up to something bigger, gaining confidence with each successful prank or harassment incident. As she packed up her materials to go home, Miss Johnson felt a sense of purpose she hadn't experienced in months. She finally understood what she was really dealing with, and she was determined to put a stop to it once and for all. These boys thought they were untouchable. They thought they could continue their behavior without facing real consequences. But they had made one crucial mistake. They had underestimated the teacher they were messing with. Miss Johnson smiled to herself as she locked her classroom door. Tomorrow, she would begin putting together a plan that would change everything. Miss Johnson spent her entire weekend planning. She spread all her notes across her kitchen table, creating a detailed map of every incident, every witness, and every piece of evidence she had gathered. But having the proof wasn't enough. She needed a way to present it that would make people listen and take action. That's when inspiration struck her on Sunday evening while she was watching the news. There was a story about a school district that had successfully addressed bullying by involving parents and community members in the solution. The reporter mentioned how powerful it was when parents saw their children's behavior firsthand, rather than just hearing about it secondhand. Miss Johnson sat up straighter on her couch. That was it. She needed to create a situation where the right people would witness the boys' behavior and attitude with their own eyes. But how could she do that without it seeming obvious or staged? Monday morning, she arrived at school with a new sense of purpose. During her planning period, she called the 3 boys' parents to request meetings. She was careful with her words, not wanting to tip them off about what she was really planning. "Hello, Mrs. Thompson. This is Miss Johnson, Jake's English teacher," she began with her first call. "I wanted to invite you to a special presentation next Friday. Jake has volunteered to present on an important topic, and I think you'd be proud to see his work." Jake's mother sounded surprised but pleased. "Oh, that's wonderful. Jake doesn't usually volunteer for extra work. What's the presentation about?" "It's about character development and making good choices," Miss Johnson replied, which was technically true. "Several students will be presenting their projects to parents and school administrators. It's part of our character education initiative." The call went better than expected. Jake's mom was excited that her son was finally showing initiative in school. She promised to be there Friday afternoon. Tyler's father was a bit more skeptical when she called him next. "Tyler volunteered to do a presentation? Are you sure we're talking about the same kid?" Miss Johnson laughed. "I know it might seem surprising, but I think Tyler has some real potential. This presentation could be a turning point for him. I really hope you can make it." By the end of the conversation, Tyler's dad had agreed to attend. He seemed curious about this new side of his son that he hadn't seen before. Cole's grandmother was the easiest to convince. She had been worried about Cole's behavior at school and was thrilled to hear that he was taking initiative. "Oh my goodness. Yes, I'll definitely be there. Thank you for encouraging him to participate." With the parents secured, Miss Johnson's next step was to invite the school administration. She sent an email to Principal Martinez, Vice Principal Davis, and the guidance counselor, Mrs. Foster. "I'm organizing a special character education presentation this Friday," she wrote. "Several students will be presenting their projects on respect, responsibility, and making good choices. I think it would be valuable for administration to see the excellent work our students are doing in this area." Principal Martinez responded quickly, saying he'd try to stop by if his schedule allowed. Vice Principal Davis confirmed she would attend, as character education was one of her main focuses. Mrs. Foster said she was definitely interested in seeing students present on such important topics. The hardest part was convincing the three boys themselves. Miss Johnson knew she had to be very careful here. If they suspected anything, they might refuse to participate or warn their parents not to come. On Tuesday, she kept the three boys after class. They walked in with their usual attitude, clearly expecting another lecture about their behavior. "I have an opportunity for you three," Miss Johnson began, sitting on the edge of her desk. "As you know, our school is focusing on character education this year. I've been asked to select students to present to parents and administrators about what good character means to them." Jake rolled his eyes. "And you picked us? That's hilarious." "Actually, I think you three have more to offer than you realize," Miss Johnson continued smoothly. "You're natural leaders. Other students pay attention to what you do and say. I think you could have a real impact if you put your minds to it." Tyler looked suspicious. "What's the catch?" "No catch," Miss Johnson replied. "You'd each prepare a short presentation about respect and character. Nothing fancy, just 5 minutes talking about what these concepts mean to you. Your parents will be there, along with some school administrators." Cole perked up at the mention of parents. "Our parents are coming." "They're very excited to see you present," Miss Johnson confirmed. "Your grandmother especially, Cole. She's so proud that you volunteered for this." The boys exchanged glances. Miss Johnson could see they were intrigued by the idea of impressing their parents and showing off in front of school officials. "Do we get extra credit?" Jake asked. "Of course," Miss Johnson nodded. "This will definitely help your grade." By the end of the conversation, all three boys had agreed to participate. They seemed to view it as an easy way to look good in front of their parents and earn some points with the school administration. Over the next few days, Miss Johnson continued her preparation. She reached out to some of her most trusted students, the ones who had witnessed the boys' behavior, and asked if they would be willing to attend Friday's presentation as audience members. She didn't tell them exactly what she was planning, but she hinted that it might be an important day for addressing some of the classroom issues they had all experienced. She also spent time creating her own presentation. While the boys would be talking about character and respect, she would be ready with documented evidence of how their actions contradicted everything they were claiming to believe in. Miss Johnson gathered screenshots of inappropriate messages that had been reported to her by other students. She collected witness statements from the teachers she had spoken with in the faculty lounge. She organized photos of damaged property and disrupted classrooms. Most importantly, she still had the video from Cole's phone showing their attempt to embarrass her. By Thursday evening, everything was in place. The parents were confirmed to attend. The school administrators had blocked off time in their schedules. Several trusted students had agreed to be part of the audience, and the three boys were actually excited about their presentations, having spent the week bragging to other students about how they were going to impress everyone. Miss Johnson felt a mixture of nervousness and anticipation as she reviewed her plan one final time. She had never done anything like this before, but she was convinced it was the right approach. These boys needed to face consequences not just from teachers or principals, but from the people whose opinions mattered most to them, their own families. Friday morning arrived with unusually warm weather for late November. Miss Johnson dressed, professionally but comfortably, knowing she would need to feel confident for what was ahead. She arrived at school early to set up her classroom for the afternoon presentation. She arranged chairs in a semicircle facing the front of the room, making sure there would be good sight lines for everyone. She tested her computer and projector to make sure her presentation materials would display properly. She even put out some cookies and coffee for the parents. wanting to create a welcoming atmosphere before things got serious. Throughout the morning, Miss Johnson's regular classes seemed to sense that something important was happening. Her students were more attentive than usual, and several asked about the special setup in the room. She simply told them that some students would be giving presentations later and left it at that. During lunch, the three boys stopped by her classroom to check on the arrangements. They seemed pleased with the setup and were clearly looking forward to showing off in front of their parents. "This is going to be great," Jake said, looking around the room. "My mom's going to be so impressed." "Mine too," Tyler agreed. "I've been practicing what I'm going to say about respect and stuff." Cole nodded enthusiastically. "My grandmother's bringing her camera. She wants to record my presentation." Miss Johnson smiled at them, but inside she felt a pang of something. Not quite guilt, but awareness of how much their world was about to change. These boys had no idea what was coming, and part of her almost felt sorry for them. But then she remembered the look of horror on her students' faces when the boys had tried to humiliate her. She thought about all the female teachers who had been harassed and all the female students who felt uncomfortable at school because of these three. Her resolve strengthened. As the final bell of the day approached, Miss Johnson took a deep breath and made her final preparations. Parents would start arriving in 30 minutes. The boys were getting ready for what they thought would be their moment to shine. Instead, it was going to be the moment when everything finally caught up with them. Miss Johnson straightened her shoulders and checked her presentation one last time. She had spent weeks preparing for this moment, and she was ready to make sure that justice was finally served. At exactly 3 o'clock, parents began arriving at Miss Johnson's classroom. Jake's mother came first, carrying a small bouquet of flowers for her son. She looked around the nicely arranged room with pride, clearly excited to see Jake finally participating in something positive at school. Tyler's father arrived next, checking his watch and looking slightly impatient but curious. He had taken time off work for this and kept glancing at his phone, but Miss Johnson could tell he was genuinely interested in seeing his son present. Cole's grandmother was the last parent to arrive, and she came with a big smile and an old digital camera hanging around her neck. She had dressed up for the occasion and was practically glowing with pride about her grandson's academic achievement. Principal Martinez and Vice Principal Davis arrived together, along with Mrs. Foster, the guidance counselor. They took seats toward the back, looking professional but relaxed. Several of Miss Johnson's trusted students had also arrived, sitting quietly in the back corners of the room. The three boys were already in the classroom, looking unusually neat and well-behaved. They had actually combed their hair and tucked in their shirts. Miss Johnson had never seen them make such an effort with their appearance. They kept glancing at their parents and whispering excitedly to each other. "Good afternoon, everyone," Miss Johnson began, standing at the front of the room. "Thank you all for taking time out of your busy schedules to be here today. We're gathered to discuss something very important: character development and the choices our young people make. Every day." The parents nodded approvingly. Jake's mother was already getting emotional, thrilled that her son was part of something so meaningful. "Before we begin with the student presentations," Miss Johnson continued, "I'd like to share some thoughts about what character really means and why it's so important in our school community." She clicked to her first slide, which showed a simple definition. Character is how you act when you think no one is watching. "This is a quote I think about often," Miss Johnson said. "It's easy to behave well when parents and teachers are looking. The real test of character is what we do when we think there won't be any consequences." The boys were still smiling, not yet realizing where this was heading. Their parents were nodding along, clearly impressed with Miss Johnson's introduction. "Over the past few months, I've been documenting behavior in our school," Miss Johnson continued, clicking to her next slide. "I've collected examples of both positive character and concerning patterns that need to be addressed." Jake's mother leaned forward, still expecting to hear good things about her son. But something in Miss Johnson's tone was starting to make the adults in the room pay closer attention. "Let me start with some examples of what character looks like in action," Miss Johnson said, clicking to a slide showing documented incidents. "Helping classmates with their work, treating all staff members with respect, taking responsibility for mistakes, creating an environment where everyone feels safe and valued. The parents were still nodding, but the boys were starting to look less comfortable. Tyler shifted in his seat and glanced nervously at his father. Unfortunately, I also have extensive documentation of the opposite behaviors, Miss Johnson continued, her voice remaining calm and professional. Systematic harassment of female staff members, inappropriate filming without consent, destruction of other students' property, creating an atmosphere of intimidation and disrespect. The room had gone completely silent. Parents were looking confused, wondering why Miss Johnson was talking about these negative behaviors during what was supposed to be a celebration of their children's character development. "Mrs. Peterson, would you please come in?" Miss Johnson called toward the door. The math teacher entered, followed by Ms. Garcia and Mrs. Chen. The three women took seats near the front of the room, their expressions serious but supportive. Jake's mother looked around the room, starting to realize that something was very wrong. "I don't understand," she said quietly. "What's going on here?" "What's going on," Miss Johnson replied gently, "is that your sons have been systematically harassing female staff members at this school for months. They've created an environment where women and girls don't feel safe or respected." Cole's grandmother gasped, her hand flying to her chest. "That can't be true. Cole would never do something like that." "I have extensive documentation," Miss Johnson said, clicking to her next slide. "Mrs. Peterson, would you please share your experience?" The math teacher stood up, her voice steady but emotional. "These three boys made inappropriate comments about my body during class. When I tried to address it, they denied everything and made me feel like I was overreacting." Tyler's father was staring at his son in shock. "Tyler, is this true?" Tyler tried to maintain his innocent act. "Dad, she's exaggerating. We were just joking around." "Ms. Garcia?" Miss Johnson prompted. The art teacher stood next. "They destroyed artwork that female students had spent weeks creating. They also took inappropriate photos whenever they thought I wasn't looking. I reported it, but nothing happened because there wasn't enough evidence." Jake was starting to panic. "Mom, don't listen to them. They're just mad because we don't like their boring classes." But Miss Johnson clicked to her next slide, which showed a timeline of documented incidents with dates, times, and witness statements. "Mrs. Chen has also experienced harassment from these three students," Miss Johnson continued. "And it's not just staff members. Several female students have reported feeling uncomfortable and unsafe because of their behavior." Cole's grandmother was now crying quietly. "Cole, please tell me this isn't true." "It's not," Cole insisted desperately. "They're lying about us." Miss Johnson clicked to her final slide. "I have video evidence of their most recent incident." The room went dead silent as she played the footage from Cole's phone, the attempt to embarrass her in front of the class while filming it. The video clearly showed the boys' intentions and their complete lack of respect for their teacher. When the video ended, no one spoke for several long moments. The parents were staring at their sons in horror and disbelief. The boys were no longer trying to maintain their innocent act. They looked terrified and ashamed. Jake's mother was the first to find her voice. "Jake, how could you do something like this? This is not how we raised you." Tyler's father stood up, his face red with anger and embarrassment. "Tyler, we're leaving. Now, you and I are going to have a very long conversation when we get home." Cole's grandmother was sobbing openly. "I am so disappointed in you, Cole, so very disappointed." Principal Martinez finally spoke up. "Boys, you're suspended effective immediately. This behavior is completely unacceptable and will not be tolerated in our school. We'll also be implementing new policies to address harassment and ensure better reporting procedures," Vice Principal Davis added. "This situation should never have been allowed to continue for so long." Mrs. Foster approached the boys' parents. "I'd like to schedule meetings with each of your families to discuss counseling and anger management resources. This behavior suggests some serious issues that need to be addressed professionally." As the parents prepared to leave with their sons, each one stopped to apologize to Miss Johnson personally. "I am so sorry," Jake's mother said, tears in her eyes. "This is humiliating and unacceptable. Jake will be writing apology letters to every teacher he's bothered, and he'll be doing community service until I decide he's learned his lesson." Tyler's father shook his head in disgust. Tyler's going to be grounded for months. No phone, no computer, no going out with friends, and he'll be getting a job to pay for any damage he's caused. Cole's grandmother hugged Miss Johnson tightly. "Thank you for bringing this to our attention. Cole will be getting professional help and he'll be making amends to everyone he's hurt. I promise you that." After everyone had left, Miss Johnson sat alone in her classroom, feeling drained but satisfied. Mrs. Peterson, Ms. Garcia, and Mrs. Chen came over to thank her. "You did something amazing today," Mrs. Peterson said. "Those boys finally faced real consequences for their actions. And their parents saw exactly what kind of behavior they've been getting away with," Ms. Garcia added. "That's going to make all the difference." Mrs. Chen nodded. "You showed them that their actions have real impact on real people. That's a lesson they'll never forget." Over the following weeks, the change in the school atmosphere was remarkable. The 3 boys returned from their suspension completely different. They kept their heads down, followed all the rules, and actually apologized sincerely to every person they had bothered. More importantly, other students noticed the change. The hallways felt safer. Female students and staff members reported feeling more comfortable and respected. Other potential troublemakers seemed to realize that inappropriate behavior would have serious consequences. Miss Johnson's classroom became a place of genuine learning and respect. Her students were more engaged, knowing that their teacher would protect them from harassment and bullying. Other teachers began coming to her for advice on handling difficult situations. The school administration implemented new training programs for all staff on recognizing and addressing harassment. They created better reporting systems and made sure that complaints would be taken seriously and investigated thoroughly.